Good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you out there, our audience, our esteemed panel members, and special guests in the audience tonight. And our program tonight is called Women Who Preach, Pioneering in the Pulpit. This panel presentation was created by Emmanuel Lutheran Church on Baker Street in Bakersfield, and we are an ELCA congregation and have partnered with the One Book Project, which is our Kern County Reading and Discussion Initiative, which is co-sponsored by Kern County Library and Cal State University Bakersfield, along with many community partners. We have been one of those community partners for the last 4 years. And what we do is create a panel discussion that is looking at the themes of each year's book from a faith-based perspective. And of course, this year's book is Broadband, the Untold Story of the Women Who Made the Internet by Claire Evans. And because of social distancing due to COVID, of course, this is our first Zoom panel format, and it's given us one wonderful advantage in that we can go beyond the barriers of Bakersfield proper and actually find and invite in panelists and special guests and audience members for all from outside of California, inside of California. So that's a wonderful dimension to our program tonight. Our moderator is Reverend Nancy Bacon. She's calling in from Tehachapi, and she will introduce the panel in a few minutes. But at this point, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce some of the special guests that are going to be in the audience tonight. Reverend Canon Melissa McCarthy was born and raised in Bakersfield, but is joining us from Southern California. She serves as Canon to the Ordinary and Chief of the Staff of the Episcopal Diocese in Los Angeles. Sister Marie Schofer is Associate Director of the Fresno Diocese for Justice Ministry for the South San Joaquin Valley. She is a founding board member of Casa Esperanza, Transitional Home for Women in Bakersfield. Reverend Elizabeth STEELE is the interim pastor at First Congregational Church, Bakersfield, UCC. Ordained by the Presbyterian Church, she has served as an intentional interim for about 24 churches. Pastor DONELLA Silviera is a Lutheran minister who has served Our Savior's Lutheran in Lancaster and has also been the interim pastor at Emmanuel Lutheran. Finally, Valerie Schultz is a writer joining us tonight from Oregon. Most of you are familiar with Valerie as a columnist, a frequent contributor to the Bakersfield, California. She has a new book out, Overdue, a Dewey Decimal System of Grace, which grew out of her experience working at Tehachapi Prison. Our panel moderator is Reverend Nancy Bacon, and Reverend Bacon is pastor at Tehachapi Community Church, UCC. She is also a certified interfaith spiritual director, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and certified practitioner of mind-body medicine. She's active with global ministry partners in Tijuana, supporting LGBTQ people in recovery with HIV, as well as projects in Uganda to assist women and children. Reverend Bacon, take it away.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I hope you've had a chance to look at the book. I know some of you haven't, and I don't want to give it all away, but I do want to say just a few words about that to tie this into our conversation this evening. I was so impressed with Claire Evans' writing and her ability to take something fairly dense and make it come alive. And it was interesting, so very interesting to read about what computers were before they were a box and this thing we put on the table or in our laps. Computers were women. Women, by and large, did so many mathematical problems. They came up with, they computed where ballistics should go, the trajectories, they cracked Nazi codes. They used math to map the heavens, finding many of the stars and comets and nebulae. Women were also networkers. They've always been sort of networkers, sort of the glue in relationships. And so while computers are very much valued for the knowledge and information we can get from them, it was really women that helped people realize, but there's more. We could have relationships online leading to this World Wide Web that we now live in. The place I got most choked up about the book, though, was reading there's many examples, but one about ENIAC, which was this dinosaur thing before the computers, that these women had to use math to try to figure out how to program this thing before anybody knew how to program anything. They did this Herculean feat and they were able to do it. And in the end, as KRISTIE said, yeah, they got pushed out of the picture. They're not even there. At the end of the book, after reading so many inspiring things about what women did that most of us probably weren't aware of, she writes about bitter fruit. She writes about how women did many of these things, and yet consumerism has taken over. And so many times things that now women experience through the computer, it's brought to us with the heavy hand of trying to sell us things. And she talked about boys and the association that we make that boys and computers go together more than girls and computers. It's sort of a myth that we have. We tend to associate boys with success and computers with success, and girls get more discouraged in various ways. She cautions us to think about the cultural myths that we tell ourselves and that we promote. When I think about bitter fruit and I think about myths, I think about Adam and Eve. And I think about the primary scripture that is used to prevent and discourage women from being leaders in Christian churches. It is from the book of Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. It says, "Let a woman learn in silence, with full submission. Permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man. She's to keep silent. For Adam was formed first and not deceived. Eve, the woman, was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she'll be saved by childbearing and through modesty." When I was a little girl growing up in the church, sitting in the pew, I remember this one day very, very clearly. I remember thinking about my place in all of this. And we had all these male pastors. I'd hear about a male God, and I'd hear about Jesus, and I'd hear about these male disciples. And then there was this one scripture that this woman is questioning Jesus about wanting to gain something from him, and he's trying to shoo her away. And she reminds him that even the dogs accept the scraps that fall. And I kept trying to remember or think about, in this hierarchy of life, where are women? Were we above or below the dogs? And I wasn't sure as a young girl in this teaching where I was supposed to fit, where we fit. We were the transgressors. And when we would hear about women, very seldom, frequently it was Eve, this transgressor. Meanwhile, at the same time in my church that I grew up in, every single girl was being molested, and it wasn't a secret. Everybody knew about it, and we were hushed. We were told, stay away from him. Good idea. That would have been a great idea. This went on until somebody was violently raped, and the secret could not just be quiet any longer. Keeping quiet or encouraging people to submit and be silent is hardly ever a good idea. It might work in the hierarchy for those at the very top because they don't want things changed. They want them to stay the same. Even Jesus's death was associated with this transgression of Eve. It's a pretty heavy thing to hold when you're a child. I hope you'll bear with me because I'd like to read part of a sermon that I wrote about this. I am a preacher and you're at Women Who Preach. The name of the sermon is Parcel-Mouthed Eve and the Serpent of Eden. A good deal of Christian theology is based on the story of Eve losing out to this crafty serpent. Eve's disobedience brought sin to all people, and Jesus eventually has to bleed to cleanse humanity. However, some Christians point to an alternative gospel version of Jesus overcoming evil in a different way. In the wilderness, Jesus beats the devil's temptations for things like food, power, and riches. There's no devil in the Adam and Eve story. In the Garden of Eden, there's only a snake, a talking snake. Like Harry Potter and Tom Riddle, apparently only Eve, not Adam, was gifted with speaking parcel tongue. In the language of Hogwarts, she was a parcel mouth, someone with the extremely rare ability to speak and understand snake. Talking animals occur in fiction and fables. 5 centuries before Christ, Greek fables were popularized by this guy, Aesop, you've probably heard of him, wrote a bunch of them. Even ancient people hearing and knowing this story of Eve and snake would have known this is a fictional tale. Yet we still treasure Aesop's fables as important stories depicting life lessons that point to great truths. The boy who cried wolf, the tortoise and the hare, the goose that laid the golden egg. They're important life lessons in the Genesis story as well. But I can't reduce Jesus' life and death as something necessary to overcome a talking snake's temptation. I see Jesus overcoming sin and evil by saying no to power, riches, and all that could replace God, things that are very common, tempting sins. The power to judge and rule over others, to be dominant and allow others to be suppressed, silenced, treated as less than. But what about nature and disobedience? The story of Eve was written in part to explain the faulty nature of women, why they must struggle with pain during childbirth. Under this logic, it's clear that in the beginning, every female animal, cow, pig, sheep, horse, etc., must have offered their male counterparts forbidden fruit in the early days of creation, because all of them experience pain in childbirth. Painful childbirth is part of being female. It's part of our nature. To blame us and explain our nature as some possible punishment for female disobedience adds insult to injury. Furthermore, this Genesis story is confusing about what life lessons it's attempting to provide. Was Eve merely disobedient? The serpent of Eden reveals God's impossible inconsistencies to Eve. God claims that humans will die if they ate from the tree of knowledge, but both the serpent and Eve knew they were going to die anyway. And women around the world have been forbidden from acquiring knowledge in many settings ever since. Yet today we know that educating women greatly reduces poverty, increases longevity, not only for the women themselves, but entire communities. If we want to make the world better, healthier, the number one thing to do is educate women. The God of this Genesis story offers Eve no real choices. She's going to die. She might as well get educated. She's the character in the story who's thoughtful, active and questioning, and a rare parcel mouth. Her partner is passive and non-reflective, not the thinker and questioner that his wife is. Eve makes a rational decision to eat from the tree of knowledge. She seeks wisdom. She's a risk taker. She doesn't choose to remain innocent and unaware, but she chooses wanting to know more about everything, which includes God and how all things work. She's interested both in knowledge and in relationships, in networking. Is the moral of the story to simply obey whatever is implied to be God's commands? Women, gays, minorities often have to question. Slaves, obey your masters. Is this the voice of God or some other means of control? Who's being scapegoated and why? Perhaps the first original sin was claiming power over others to control them. There's another creation story in Genesis. Chapter 2 tells us that the first person made was a human being, not necessarily a male. God created a human. Then later we get the first words differentiating women and men, both created simultaneously from the original human and both made in the image of God. How we read things and who writes the story makes a difference. Our myths matter. Those tempted by power find it easy to read Eve as a second or subordinate to Adam, provides the bedrock for feminine suppression to this day. Those tempted by power can find a handful of scriptures to suppress women in ministry. Others find numerous scriptures to say the opposite, like Joel chapter 2:28, with Peter's Pentecostal proclamation that the Spirit's poured out on all, sons and daughters, and both shall prophesy, and the Apostle Paul, who worked with many named women, networking together, the early church, proclaiming in Christ there's no male or female any longer. On and on, we see stories of Jesus. His resurrection might not have been told if not for the women in the Gospel of Mark. And throughout the Gospels, women are proclaiming his identity, even though they're often overshadowed or not in the pictures. Jesus challenged the power structures of his day, turning things upside down, claiming the first shall be last, the last shall be first, preaching good news to the oppressed, and inviting followers to do the same. Today, the modern church should still feel discomfort and challenge from these teachings. My denomination believes God's always called unlikely folks to follow in these footsteps, preaching good news, especially to and for the least powerful, the silenced. Thank you. We have a distinguished panel here this evening. Each one in turn will get to give their story, their response of what ministry has been like for them as a pioneer in the pulpit. And I next want to invite our next panel speaker, who is Pastor Trina Turner. Pastor Turner is the co-pastor of Victory and Praise Church in Stockton, and she's the executive director of Faith in the Valley. Pastor Trina left 25 years of corporate leadership in the telecommunications industry to join her husband in planting Victory and Praise Church in Stockton. After ordination, rose to serve as executive pastor. In 2014, she was introduced to faith-based community organizing through PICO, a nationwide nonprofit fighting for environmental, racial, and economic dignity for all. She now serves as the executive director of Faith in the Valley, a merger of the 5 Central Valley PICO affiliates. Pastor Turner, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Reverend Nancy. And I'd like to just begin by just thanking the One Book Project, Emmanuel Lutheran, Pastor Don, and of course, all of the amazing women and men of this project that has invited me into this sacred space, and your story that you shared, that you entrusted us with tonight. Just was a blessing for me. I wanted to start out, I am Pastor Trina Turner, yes, pastor at Victory and Praise Church. Victory and Praise is a non-denominational church in the city of Stockton. And my husband and I both have also planted several other churches where we have 14 churches. But I want to go back, and I actually want to kind of start, if you'd allow me in my space and my time to come forth in my own way. There's a song that we sing, the older people, actually, we don't really sing it anymore. The older people would sing a song, and it kind of went like this. It goes, if it had not been for the Lord on my side, tell me where would I be? Where would I be if it had not been for the Lord on my side, tell me where would I be? Where would I be? And I'll explain this later, but it goes into this part. It says, you see, he kept my enemies away. He let the sun shine through a cloudy day. He rocked me in the cradle of his arms when he knew I'd been battered by the storm. Well, if it had not been for the Lord on my side, tell me where would I be? Where would I be? Yeah. Like I said, we don't sing it anymore in our current church, but that song is a truth for me in the journey of my life that has brought me to this point in ministry and in this place in leadership. And if it had not been for the Lord that was on my side, because oftentimes as women in ministry, we feel that there aren't a whole lot of others that are on our side. And the thing I love about the journey that God has blessed me to be on is well before I saw leadership ability in myself, well before I ever received a call or a passion to move into ministry, God began to sow some things into me, began to plant and knit some things together that I didn't know what I would do with. Have you ever started making a dish and didn't quite know how it was going to come together? Or perhaps for some of you started crocheting something, because I do know how to crochet. And it started out going to be one thing, and the shape of it started looking a little bit different. And you says, well, perhaps I'll make something else out of it. Yeah, I was not quite sure at the age of 17 when I received a call from, at that time, Pacific Bell. I thought it an odd thing. There was a program that they put together while I was in my high school year. And God had already placed some special ability in me. So I was in a lot of the honors classes, getting ready to graduate early in a family that did not have provision or have conversation about college. I was graduating in January of 1978, and God had the telephone company to call me. That was the first call, because when I received the call to go down to the office, I knew that I was a straight A student. I knew that I was never in trouble. And it was an offer to participate in a program where they actually, the telephone company, proactively sought me out to be a part of a new job opportunity. So that I left high school in January 25th, 1978, and started working February 3rd for the telephone company. So full-time, full benefits, and to a program that I didn't know. I thought I'd already won a lotto or struck it rich or something, this amazing job that I had. It was just preparation for where God wanted me to go. I went through telephone company as far as being an operator, and then into management. And I want to speed through this part because I want to get through the if it had not been for God. All the while, for every promotion that God blessed me with, I felt for sure that I was an imposter. And at some point, they were going to figure out that they really did not mean to reach out to Trina George from Richmond, California, in a predominantly Black school without a college education. But God saw fit for me to have promotion after promotion, to the point where it would land me in rooms with all my white men with lots of diplomas, and me wondering again, what in the world am I doing here? God, what is your plan for my life? I would sit in a room. I could so resonate with the women, the untold stories of the women in broadband, and could only imagine the kind of the anxiousness, the apprehension, the nerves about having a passion, having a knowledge, and having to carefully craft when I should speak up and share it and when should I not. Am I now just the help? Am I now just the EEO hire? Am I now just the check the box Black girl that's here? Or do I dare speak that I have the answer for what you're struggling with? It was very difficult times. I sat time after time in board meetings, silent, afraid to use my own voice, afraid to use the giftings that God had given me to speak up and say, I have the answer, the resolution for what you're struggling with, because they'd be talking about it for hours, it seemed to me. And for sure, if what was in my head was the answer, they would have already come up with it. Most of my career, I was the only female. Most of my career, I was for sure the only Black person or person of color. And when I would dare speak up in answer, mustering every bit of strength that I had, trying to put on my big girl voice and sound as powerful as the men in the room. What if I think we should. Would it be okay if we tried? And everything would get silent because the Black girl dared to speak up. And they would look and they'd say it again. And internally, I would say, stupid, stupid, stupid. That was the wrong answer. Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. And I'm like, God, give it to me again, because I was not quite sure what I said that would make them all stop. I would repeat it and it would become my answer for only about 10 minutes. And after a while, surely that was the same thing one of them had said all along. So I could again look at the ladies when we were talking about the computers in the book, and when they took credit for so many things, I was like, this is I kept flipping the pages looking for them to tell my story here, because once the publication went out, once there was accolades, once there was awards, once there were dinners and late night whatever gatherings, for sure Trina Turner was not a part of that celebration. And all of a sudden it was just slightly different. I got them started thinking, but they really had the right solution. And I kept thinking, that sounds just like what I said, but okay. Moved through a few different different job opportunities through the telephone company, and much of that didn't change. But all along, there were mentors in my life and people that stabilized and provided me with a strong foundation. For me, it was the church that I grew up in. And as helpful as they were also part of the problem. I grew up in an apostolic church in Richmond, North Richmond to be exact, an all-Black church. And as much love and care and protection that they had, they were also very complicit in ensuring that women kept their place. So you could be brilliant, but not too brilliant. You can have a voice, but not too much of a voice. And it for sure always needed to be subject to a male authority. You could bring your ideas and present it and allow someone else to speak on your behalf. But there was this woman, one of my first, I know her now to be a mentor. Her name was Mother Verdell Thompson. Why was her name Mother? Because women couldn't be preachers or pastors where I grew up. So you were a missionary. If you had any sort of word, scripture that you wanted to deliver, they would let you be a missionary. And as you got older, you became a mother. And so Mother Verdell Thompson, powerful woman of God that she was, always encouraged, not just me, all of the young people, that said, you can be and do anything you want to be. Sounded good, but with so many other loud voices telling me who I could be and could not be, her voice was just one, but something about the realness that she would state that kind of stuck with me over the years. Verdell said you could be anything. If someone else is doing it, why can't you? If someone else has created, you can create the same thing. And I would tell her about some new amazing thing that I heard, saw, or thought of. And she's like, was that yours? I'm thinking, this is different than what because mind you, starting the telephone company at 17, I was still very much in my formative years. She stuck with me. Fast forward in time, got married very early. Thank God for a husband that also believed that I can do anything and be anyone. So that as we moved out to the Central Valley into the city of Stockton, very much at this point traveling everywhere for the telephone company, Pacific Bell, ATT, SBC, I did all of the iterations, and helping others be their best management selves or what have you. My husband, we planted a church. And as people were coming into the church, I was giving of some of those same lessons that I had been practicing on the telecommunications folk. And I began to pour into them and apply scripture. And I learned early on that leadership in the church, there's a very different path than just leadership. You know, what did God call you to be? And I don't want to manipulate you into what I want you to be. I want to now teach you how to reach your best level in God based on what he's called you to do. So I began to mentor other people, spoon-fed by God, because I didn't have a lot of leadership up until that point. After we planted our first church, second church, third church, there got to be a rub. Do I continue to fly around everywhere for the telephone company doing what is so needed within our own community, within our own churches? And all while I was just doing it because I was pastor's wife, Trina. But these women here, it was interesting because as I read them, I said, yeah, these ladies here, they felt a fire in their bellies and a drive and a passion to do more than the conventional call of the day. See, after people oppress you for so long and tell you who you can't be, they don't need to stay around any longer. They live up here in your mind. My husband never said that I couldn't pastor, that I couldn't have a call. But every time I felt a call to ministry, it was like, yeah, let me just teach. Let me just share. Let me just, oh, are you, no, I'm not a pastor. No, right? Not at all. Back in 2000, I believe it was 2003, finally, I began to really hear God call me to more. What are you afraid of? If God be for you, who can be against you? I'm more than the whole world against you. There is no male or female in Christ Jesus. So I knew all those scriptures and I'm studying them and I taught them for other women. I thought it was good for them. And it finally got to a point where I had to acknowledge the call that I had on my life. And the biggest challenge I faced in my mind was to tell my husband, which was now a bishop, that I am called to pastor. Because what does that mean? And he's the pastor. Oh, man. And it was all in my mind because, of course, when I did mention it to him, he was excited. He's like, this is amazing. This is wonderful. What did God tell you to do? Because we want to make sure that you do exactly that. Because for me, although I believe in women pastors, and my husband, we believe in women pastors, etc., I was called to be a support to the work that he already had going. And so I acknowledged my call. My husband ordained me in an amazing service after we went through a lot of schooling and all those different things. And then it gets me to the point of these women brings me back to them again, because this other mentor that I had, Pastor Amelia Adams in the city of Stockton, she said, Pastor Trina, when you got here, you brought some things with you that we're not used to seeing. And I heard God speaking to me about merging the things that he invested in me and 25 years in the corporate world into the church world. And I thought that was great. I left the telephone company, not old enough to say I'm retired. I'll be celebrating a 60th birthday soon, but not quite there with the numbers. I left the telephone company. I felt like I did all God called for me. I worked and served with my husband. We're planting churches. I thought God was done. I was set. I'm a granny. Good, I'm done. And God still had more, right? It's almost like the women after he was shut down because a war ended, men coming back, et cetera. Do I go back to domestic work? Do I do something? No, God always has a higher calling in our life. And so I received then information about this organizing work that brings me to where I am today. And it blew my mind. I'm like, I'm old now. I don't have time. I don't have the capacity to take on more. But all of those lessons that God had planted in me before about just research and learning how to interact with different people, learning how to hear some uncomfortable things. I even give credit to the men that said some pretty ugly things when I was in several meetings in my younger days. I can hear all kinds of things in the work that I'm in right now and maintain a smile. And I'm thinking, God, I thought that was something I did, but it was you all along. Thank God for the women, right, that have endured many heartaches and disappointments and setbacks and did not have their work acknowledged, but still felt the call and the pull of something greater. The book, when you read through it, you'll see by the time it gets to the end, it says, yeah, we're not there yet. We're still waiting to build. There's still more that needs to be done. For all of the hope and promise and aspiration of the internet and all of the programming that was brought about there, it also has brought about some things and revealed some things that we were not necessarily wanting to see or know. But just like the things that has been written into it. We have the ability, thank God for the nurturing ability of a woman that can hear some things and begin to knit some differences together in unity, finding common spaces. And it's my hope and aspiration that in my last leg of life, last journey, as we go through this, I don't imagine God has another thing for me to do, but outside of this work. But I'm hopeful that I will continue to stay in the ready position to continue to write more code into the program of my life. And so I'm just excited to be here. I thank you for your invitation, and I'll turn it back over to you now, Reverend Nancy.
Thank you so much, Pastor Trina. Thank you for that. It's great to hear your speech and your story. Now I want to invite Reverend Dawn Wilder to speak. She is the pastor at Emmanuel Lutheran Church. She's been serving there since March of 2017, first ordained in 1996 by the MCC churches, transferred her ordination to the ELCA. She has over 10 years experience working with the homeless and underprivileged youth. She's also worked as a chaplain and bereavement counselor for hospice. She holds a Master's of Divinity from Fuller Theological Seminary, completed a 2-year residency in clinical pastoral education at UCLA Medical Center, and she holds an MA in technology-based education from CSU Dominguez Hills. It's good to have you here, Dawn.
Thank you. When we were in the planning stages of this, I said, oh, just put me in the middle. Then I didn't realize I'd have to follow Pastor Trina. So, but such an amazing and inspiring story. Thank you. For myself, I felt called to ministry at a very young age. When other kids were playing house, I played church, and listen to, I can totally understand John Lewis when he talks about how he was preaching to the chickens, except for I always found that the cows paid better attention. I was raised, though, in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, and their stance on women there's no real place for women in leadership in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, any kind, much less being a pastor. The most I could ever aspire to be would be a director of Christian education. And so that's what I set out to do when I graduated from high school. I was going to continue to follow this call that I had and be a director of Christian education. And I started going to college for that. And at the end of our second year, they brought all of the students together who were making this their career, and they told us what to expect, both from the program and then from your call in the future. And at that meeting, they said that men could expect to have a starting pay of around $20,000 a year. And at the time, that was a respectable wage. And then they said, and women could expect 9. And I said goodbye. Literally, I left. And then I was lost. I didn't know what I was going to do. I finished out my undergraduate degree in a really what I would call a hodgepodge of institutions. It's absolutely a mess. And I spent a long time like kind of church surfing, going to all kinds of different churches. And this was all in the 1980s, and large evangelical churches were really coming to their own. And so I went to a lot of them, and there was one pastor who used his sermons to crawl through the Bible word for word, always referring to the original Greek. And I was so intrigued by it that I think that's when I first thought about going to seminary. But I certainly didn't have any clear path to ministry at that time yet. And it also didn't help that I was struggling with my own sexuality. And the fundamental churches, they seem to have the clearest answer to this. And so with their guidance, I spent a great deal of energy and time and prayer trying to be healed of being a lesbian. And mostly I got to a point where I just felt I just needed to turn all of my feelings off and see what I could do in the mission field. So I ended up in the Philippines and helping out in an orphanage, and then went on to China. And it was after that experience that I came back and I enrolled at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena. I registered for their MDiv program, mostly because I was still fascinated with Greek, and I had no concept that I could be a pastor. None. That, you know, even my mom was like horrified that I was going to seminary, being the good Missouri Synod Lutheran person that she was. She would tell people, well, she's going to seminary, but she's not going to be a pastor. It wasn't actually into my final year at Fuller that I got the idea that I wanted to be a pastor. And this actually came out of a single unit of clinical pastoral education at UCLA. The supervisor there was a woman, and she encouraged me to step into that identity. You know, and I was really young then still, and I looked even 10 years younger than I was. So it was almost impossible to get anyone to take me seriously as a chaplain at this hospital. And she encouraged me to get a clergy shirt and to wear it. And while I had seen lots of pictures of women in clergy shirts, the first person I ever saw, the first woman I ever saw in person with the collar on was myself looking in the mirror. And putting that on, I think there were several different things, but I do remember like walking around UCLA Medical Center, and so many people would like look at me and then call me father. They just didn't know what to say. So again, you know, that doesn't happen anymore, but back then, you know, 20 some years ago, it was still quite unusual to see a woman in a collar. It was also my experience at UCLA and at Fuller, some of the classes I took there, and a final, I would say one final huge rally to pray away the gay that got me to a place where I could come out of the closet. And I actually ended up coming out 2 months before I was supposed to graduate from Fuller. And they have a very strict anti-gay clause. And they almost pulled my degree. I even had to meet with the president of the seminary and several other very intimidating men. And I think looking back at it, Dr. Hubbard was also retiring that year from being president of the seminary. And I think he just didn't want the controversy. And so I slipped through. Of course, once I was out, that really limited my possibilities as a minister. I eventually found myself to the MCC churches and was ordained through them in 1996 and served as an associate pastor. I worked with many homeless people in the West Hollywood area. I ran a drop-in center for homeless teens in the West Hollywood area. And I also then served as an interim pastor and pastor of a church through them. And then gosh, it must have been 4 or 5 years ago now, maybe more than that, 6, I don't know, I lose track now. but I transferred my ordination to the Evangelical Lutheran Churches of America. They began ordaining LGBTQ plus people in 2009. And so this year is actually, it's the 50th anniversary of ordaining women in that denomination, the 40th of ordaining African American women in the denomination, and then the 10-year anniversary of ordaining LGBTQ plus people in the denomination. And now I've been at Emmanuel Lutheran in Bakersfield for about over 3 years now, and really love it here in Kern. I find it to be a unique challenge, being the only lesbian pastor, I think, in Kern County. No one has challenged me on that yet. But happy to be here.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you so much for your amazing story. I want to now invite our fourth and final panelist to share with us. It's Rabbi Cheryl Rosenstein, formerly of Temple Bethel. She's now retired, but is Rabbi Emerita there after serving for 26 years. During her tenure, she also served as president of the erstwhile Bakersfield Interfaith Ministerial Association, the convener of the Kern Clergywomen, and was an active member of Faith in the Valley's Clergy Caucus. She now resides in Santa Rosa, is the High Holy Day Cantoral Soloist at Temple Israel of Alameda, a member of Congregation Shomrei Torah, and of the North Bay Organizing Project's Clergy Caucus. Rabbi Cheryl, it's a pleasure to have you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be home, so to speak, and to be in such wonderful company. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here this evening. Where to start? The first known woman ordinee of historic record, well, of modern historic record, was ordained in 1935. Her name was Regina Jonas, and she perished during the Holocaust. Fast forward to 1970, I was talking about growing up in a Reformed synagogue and my family's commitment to Jewish life. And it wasn't until I sat down to write the essay to enter rabbinic school when I was approaching the end of my college career that anything stacked up at all. I've been tracking this way throughout my lifetime and had no idea. I had to be hit on the head with a 2x4, so to speak. The summer between my sophomore and junior years of college, that was the time I needed to think about declaring a major. I lost a grandparent. I lost a relationship. It was a traumatic summer, but I at a Jewish summer camp. And instructor. Because my rabbi growing up demanded that every bar or bat mitzvah or their family following their rite of passage give something back to the synagogue. And my choice was to give of myself by serving as the assistant to the Israeli folk dance teacher. And then subsequently I became the Israeli folk dance teacher. So off I went to camp to teach Israeli folk dancing. And this camp, although it had many Jews in it, did not have exclusively Jews in it. And it turned out that other than the director and I, nobody knew what they were doing. And so every cabin had to take turns leading services. And I became the go-to gal for just determining what prayer came first, because a lot of the staff simply hadn't paid any attention in Hebrew school. So behind my back, they started calling me rabbi. And when I got wind of that, I was very, very upset about that, because I knew that I held my own rabbi in great esteem and that I did not have that education, and how dare they call me that. But when I got back to campus, I needed to give something some thought. I needed to figure out what my major was going to be, what I was going to be doing with my life. I had been, throughout my growing up years, besides training with the cantorial soloist and learning a lot of Jewish liturgy as long as other music and teaching Israeli folk dance, I went through confirmation services as a teen. I'd spent my life growing up in the synagogue, and then I turned around and gave back to my synagogue. I went to Jewish camp for many summers. I served as a counselor. And it wasn't, as I said, until I sat down to write the essay for admission into the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion that my life made any sense to me at all. Fortunately, they were kind enough to admit me. And 5 years later, I went right from college straight into seminary. So I was ordained in 1990 after spending a year in Jerusalem, 2 years in Los Angeles, and then 2 years in Cincinnati, Ohio. My first pulpit was, as an ordinee, was in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I was an assistant rabbi. But through my education, we had student pulpits. My first student pulpits happened to be in Ridgecrest, California, at China Lake Naval Weapons Center Hebrew Congregation, Temple Beth Torah. This was in the mid-1980s. I was not their first woman, but I wasn't far along. And in fact, when I was still in seminary, there was a moment prior to my ordination where I thought it would be a good idea to count the number of women. I had a directory from the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which was basically the alumni list of all the graduates of the Hebrew Union College, with few exceptions. And at that point, so by the mid-1980s, there were something over 200 women, Reform women, in the rabbinate. The conservative movement in Judaism had only just begun admitting women into their program and ordaining them about the year that I applied to HUC. So again, in the mid-1980s. The Reconstructionist movement of Judaism began ordaining in 1976. As I said, Rabbi Prisan was ordained in 1972. How did I even get the idea that I could do this as a woman, since my rabbi growing up was a man, and not that I knew a lot of rabbis, but the rabbis I knew were largely men. Fortuitously, when I got to college, there was a campus rabbi, a Hillel rabbi. He was a male. He was there about a year, and then he left. And then the organization hired a woman to be our campus rabbi. And so I had, at least in my head, I had a relationship with Rabbi Sandy Bogan, not as I would regard it, it wasn't what I would regard as a mentoring relationship, because I hadn't made any decisions at that point in my life. I wasn't really considering it, but the idea that she was there meant that there was a possibility. And I'm very grateful to her for her leadership and for her, I guess, quiet mentorship and the example that she provided for me. My male rabbi, was a singing rabbi, and so it was foreordained, I guess, that I should also be a singing rabbi. So my first student pulpit was in Ridgecrest. I remember a particular moment. It was my first High Holy Day services. I was only served there for 1 year. My first High Holy Day service, and I had carefully gone through the entire prayer book for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and figured out what I was going to do in Hebrew and what I was going to do in English. And at the very last moment, I changed my mind about one particular prayer. I was standing before the ark, the structure that held the Torah scrolls, and I was going to read a prayer for peace. And the word nuclear was in the prayer. I wasn't making it up. It was just right there in the book. And I had my back to the congregation, and I felt this wave of ice wash over me as I uttered these words, because this was a largely civilian congregation meeting in the All Faith Chapel by the good graces of the other chaplains on the base. And the congregants were trembling in fear that there would be some plant, some spy in the congregation who would overhear my blasphemy about praying for peace and the end of nuclear anything on a base whose job it was to test nuclear weapons. And they were afraid that I was going to get them kicked off the base, which didn't happen. But I remember that very chilling moment. Subsequently, my next student pulpit was in Modesto, California, where I served as once a month for 2 years. And then when I moved to the Cincinnati campus, because the Los Angeles campus was at that time not an ordaining campus, I served a pulpit in Kalamazoo, Michigan for 2 years. So this was all the training I had under my belt when I got to St. Paul, Minnesota, where I served as an assistant rabbi. And I had very good mentoring there by my male colleague under challenging circumstances. The congregation had, prior to my arrival, been through a trauma involving previous staff that I was utterly unaware of. And so it gave me good armor as I emerged from that experience after 3 years, so that when I got the call from the regional director of the Reform Movement saying, Cheryl, you need to apply to Bakersfield, I said, really? And the voice on the other end of the phone said yes. And I did, and I was there very happily for 26 years. So there were over 200 women when prior to my ordination. And now I believe there are in the vicinity of 800 women in the Reform Movement. That's not counting now our conservative and Reconstructionist colleagues. I say that because throughout my tenure in Bakersfield, well, I'm sure there were inappropriate comments. They kind of washed right over me. I knew that I was a woman in what had been a boys' game. And I felt mostly that I received nothing but mostly respect. I had to earn some of it, but I didn't feel traumatized or unduly belittled or not taken seriously. Although I did take the precaution when I got to Bakersfield, I did insist for many years that they call me Rabbi Rosenstein and not Rabbi Cheryl, as many of my Christian colleagues were doing, particularly the men, because I knew how difficult it was for a woman to be taken seriously, and I wanted them to take me seriously. I felt like I lived in quite a bubble, and I thought perhaps that, women had overcome a lot of the harassment and the trials, that I had really been standing on the shoulders of all the women who had come before me, both Jewish and Christian in ministry. And the Me Too movement really took my breath away, and still does. The idea that my female colleagues, my younger colleagues, as well as some older ones, are still experiencing the trauma, the misogyny, the sexism, all of those things that are still happening to women, not just in churches and synagogues, but all over the professional world. But it really struck me that it was still happening in the world of the synagogue. I really do feel that I stood on the shoulders of giants coming before me. And I'm prayerful that we can turn a corner, that this country is really on a cusp of something. We have swung so far in one direction, in a wrong direction, in a painful direction. And so many people are suffering such great ills for so many reasons. And we have decisions to make, and I'm prayerful that we will make the right decision and see our way through these times and create a world that is lighter and brighter for all of us. Dibarti.
Thank you, Rabbi. Great to see you. Thank you for your story.
Thank you.
Now I want to invite again our panelists or our invited guests. If there are questions, comments from anything that you've heard from any of the speakers so far, to be able to just start a conversation about that. And I know that there was Pastor Trina was speaking, and I also know that Sister Marie had raised her hand, but if others raise their hand, we'll call on you. Pastor Trina, we cut you off. What were you in the middle of saying earlier?
You know what? I'm not certain. I was just trying to make sure I get something going because I was believing God that Rabbi Rosenstein was going to join back in. So let's just go ahead with those that raised their hands.
Very good. Thank you. And is Sister Marie here with us? I know she was earlier, but I'm not seeing her picture right now. Sister Marie, are you still with us? Not seeing.
Can you hear me now?
Good, good. All right, yes.
It wasn't really anything of import, but in listening to Dawn playing church when she was a little girl, I used to play priest on the front lawn with my friend across the street, and I would, get an old bedspread and pretend it was the vestment and so on, and this and this little Necco wafers. If you remember those. And my friend, she was Protestant, across the street, played right along with me, and I often think of that, and that struck a chord. The other chord, of course, it struck was the opportunities for you, Dawn, are not as yet opportunities for me and others like me. Not that I ever felt called to priesthood. Obviously, I felt called to church ministry as a Roman Catholic nun. So, but that really, my ears kind of really pricked when you said that, Dawn. And the other thing, I'm really amazed listening. Each of you have a different story for different reasons, each of which caused great struggle and at times hurt. And I'm just, I've hobnobbed with each one of you in some way, shape, or form, and I'm touched to hear the stories of each of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Sister Marie.
I don't play priest anymore, but anyway.
Are there others? Any questions, comments, connections from our panelists or any of our invited guests this evening? We'd love to hear from you.
Well, I would like to go back to something you said, Nancy, about the time when in reading the book when it was the time in the book, and I've gotten through maybe 6 chapters, but it was that first chapter when I got to the end of it and read about those women who gave everything they had with great passion and with great desire to really work through and get the job done. And then they were cut out of the picture in the newspaper. I mean, that practically took my breath away. Not that it surprised me, but all I could think of was all that they had done to contribute to the success of that big beast, really. And to suddenly be just kind of, they weren't there, period.
Yes.
And that really struck me. And of course, as you go through the chapters, more of the same type of thing. And yeah.
I guess when I was reading it too, I thought of all the times that her story is not part of history. So many times that women are, they vanish into the words and out of the picture.
And with that, when
and
Rabbi Rosenstein was talking a bit ago, one of the things she wrote down, Rabbi, you said, it gave me good armor. And it kind of made me chuckle a bit because I think that is the way to think of a lot of the heartaches, disappointments, things that didn't work quite the way we intended is, no, this is good armor. This is preparing me for where I need to go. And so as, the conversation right now is being continued, I'm thinking, yeah, good armor. And because of the tenacity of a woman, the determination, and just the call and knowing what our roles are, and not traditional. I'm talking about in history right now, the path that we have to forge. We never consider, just going home, taking our marbles. We're not going to play. Forget it. You didn't call my name. I'm not going to do it. We show back up again, because here I am. I was here yesterday and I'm back again today, with more to say. And I'm not going to shrink or shirk back or not fulfill the place that I'm in. One of the things my mom would talk a lot about is about standing in your place, not in your place as some would think, get in a corner. It's like, no, be all of who you're called to be. Trina, if you're you are the best you can be. And if you do that role, leave somebody else to do their. So don't try and emulate someone else. Don't be like someone else. Stand in your place, speak your voice and your truth, and then always be open to learn more from others. So yeah, I'll take that quote with me as well as just a framing. It gave me good armor.
Thank you, Trina.
Thank you. I see Melissa McCarthy has her hand up too, so I want to call on her.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. It's been really great to hear you and hear your stories. The question I have, and this can be for any panelist who wants to answer, is maybe a story or two about what kind of resistance you've encountered, maybe particularly around your preaching, prophetic preaching. What sort of resistance you've encountered in that important work that you do.
I have a story. Years ago, there was a Jewish man on the presidential ticket. Joe Lieberman was held the vice presidential nominee slot. And Joe Lieberman, you'll recall, was orthodox. I mean, he was a very serious Jew. He took his Judaism very seriously, and he was public about the fact that he took his Judaism seriously. And I noticed a lot of Jewish people were made very uncomfortable by his ownership of his Judaism. And so I chose to give a sermon questioning why it was that some Jews are so uncomfortable with this very public Jew. And that's what the sermon was about. I got a letter from a married pair of congregants who didn't hear a word I said. All they heard was I was talking about Joe Lieberman, and they thought I was endorsing the ticket, which I wasn't, which of course I would never do. That's a good way to lose your tax status in the synagogue. But all the years that I was in Bakersfield, it was particularly challenging to speak prophetically, because Scripture is political. It's a political document, and I always felt that I could speak words of Torah, I could speak words of Scripture, but I had to kind of walk a line, because I think all congregations are bipartisan, and you need to be everybody's rabbi or everybody's pastor, and so that was a very thin tightrope on which to walk. So that's my contribution to that discussion. It's challenging, and yet that's what we're called to do. I think that if you are serving a congregation in the capacity in which that we have in common, that we need to speak truth to power, that in my tradition especially, Judaism identifies with the prophetic tradition, and the words of prophets were never welcome. But that's what we're called to do.
I would just say I think I'm pretty lucky. My congregation seems to be a group that really likes to think about things. So people might disagree with me. They might think I'm completely off base, but I think they appreciate being able to consider things. I haven't felt too much pushback at my congregation, sometimes, usually one particular person. But where I've felt it more is even outside of my church community, with what some might call the boys' club, where I was invited into a prayer event that was all men. And then later I was told, we're really, really sorry, but we can't have you with us. And honestly, I kind of laugh sometimes because I feel like that's okay. Me and Jesus are going to go play someplace else anyway. You guys do your thing.
And for me, I think I've been pretty, Reverend Nancy said lucky. I've been pretty lucky as well, blessed, etc., to be able to speak, especially now. The difference, I think, just the nuanced difference is the church that I grew up in, which again was amazing for a lot of reasons, but held the belief that they did, have actually changed some. And it's interesting because as I get an invitation, much smaller congregation, older congregation now than when I was growing up. But if I go back, I'm clear that I'm going back as Mother Trina, or I'm going back as Sister Trina. I don't think they too much call me missionary, but I'm always aware. It hasn't been up front in your face, oh, you can come here, but you can't use this title. But I'm very aware that I've never been referred to as the ordained elder or as Pastor Trina. It's usually Mother Trina, Mother Turner, very welcoming, very loving, but there are still some of the telltale signs that are around. And yeah, still waiting on that. Well, I won't waiting. I think I'll let them be who they are too.
I have a couple experiences with pushback. The one that it was very clear when I was first transferring to the ELCA. I did my kind of like an internship. They couldn't call it that, but I'll just call it an internship with a church in Torrance, and it was it's one of the larger congregations in the South, in the Los Angeles area, and there were members that really had issues with both me being a woman, and quite a few, both being a woman and being gay, and there were specific people that the pastor was told he needed to call and tell them that I was preaching that day so they wouldn't come to church. Mm. And that was upsetting. I'll just put it there. You know, and interestingly enough, after me, I kind of over the time there kind of was able to win over much of the congregation and kind of break through their reluctance to having a female in the pulpit. And after that, they had subsequent interns, 3 more females, and all of them actually ended up having excellent experiences. So I'm grateful that I was able to kind of plow the way for them in that. But there was real serious pushback at the beginning.
I see there's a couple of other hands. There's some hands up, and so good. That's great. I want to call on Reverend Donella next.
I was thinking about a time about pushback. Besides the number of times that I would be supplying in a church, and they would say, it's the first time we've ever heard a woman preach, that struck me as kind of strange. But this one particular time where it wasn't exactly pushback, I don't suppose, but I was in seminary and I went out one Sunday to a congregation, and as I was standing in the narthex, and a man walked in, and the president of the congregation was standing there, and he pulled me aside and he pointed the man out and he said, I want you to understand that this man is always negative. He never has anything good to say about anything. And so there's a very good chance that at the end of the service, he's going to have something not nice to say. So we came to the end of the service, and I was standing at the door greeting people, and sure enough, he came along and he said, "I disagreed with everything you said, but I sure like the way you said it." So preaching can be taken in a number of ways. And I really left glad to know that he listened. He may have disagreed, but at least he listened, at least he heard. The other thing that I was going to say is that Pastor Don mentioned that within the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, we have been celebrating the 50 years of the ordination of women. We have a tradition within our church that, you feel a call to ministry, but then as you enter seminary, you have what's called a candidacy committee that walks with you through those 4 years to help further discern that sense of call. At the end, you graduate with the seminary and the candidacy committee together, having affirmed that yes, you have the skills, the ability, and the sense of call to be ordained. So you walk out and you've got a master's of divinity. However, within our tradition, you are not ordained until a congregation calls you, until a congregation is able to say, yes, we see in you the call of God. So while women were able to be ordained 50 years ago, congregations were very slow in accepting women of color. And so the reason that we celebrate the 40th anniversary is that even though there were women of color within that very first class, it wasn't until 10 years later that a congregation was able to say to a woman of color, we will call you to be our pastor. And that's why we have the differences in those dates. It also says something about the willingness of congregations, especially in predominantly white majority congregations, to take a chance. So women tend to wait longer for calls. If you are a person of color, you wait longer. If you are a person with a disability, you wait longer. That is not something I celebrate, but something that we recognize, and we are working as a denomination, making some intentional steps in order to recognize God's call to ministry.
Thank you. I wanted to say, unfortunately, my computer dropped me for a few minutes, so I missed some of what you were saying, but I caught the very beginning, and thank you for sharing. Elizabeth Steele has raised her hand, so I'd like to call on her next.
Forgot that I needed to be unmuted for a moment. I wanted to share a story from early in my career that is pushback to the pushback. Because early on, I was asked to do 1 year as was within my synod, a women in ministry project, which basically meant go out and be the token woman preaching in as many congregations as you can. And in basically every congregation I've preached that way, I was the first woman that they had heard. I was in preaching in one congregation where they happened to be looking for an associate pastor. And as I preached, a gentleman, an older gentleman sitting a few rows back, but in front of me, began to yawn. But it wasn't a quiet yawn. It was, oh, oh. And the more I ignored him, the louder he got. I was just at the point of saying, what do? Do I ask the ushers to please provide this gentleman with a pillow? when the woman sitting 2 seats away from him, about the same age, reached around the person in front, in between them, and swatted him hard. He shut up. But I am pretty sure he was the same gentleman who walked out, looked at me and said, "I still don't think we should hire a woman," and walked straight on out the door. So even early on, there was pushback to the pushback that we didn't always see. That day I got to see it.
Great
And I had
story.
yeah. Many years later, I had the exact opposite kind of experience when I had been asked to do a funeral for a man I didn't even know. At the end, his brother came up to me and said, "I've buried 4 of my siblings in the last 2 years. This was the best service to sit through. I'm going home and speak for women ministers."
Wow.
It comes slowly, but it does come.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up. Melanie, I'm wondering, do you have questions from anyone else? Does anyone else have questions?
We have no questions that from the chat box. It is 8:27. We're coming up towards the Melissa, it looks like, has her hand up. Go ahead, Melissa.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say 2 things. One, in my experience with pushback from folks that I have built a relationship with over time, when I've had a chance to unpack what some of their resistance to whatever I'm preaching has been, it has generally not been about what I'm preaching at all, but has been sort of a displacement of whatever is going on in their lives. So it became a real pastoral opportunity. And so, which is great. I mean, that means that we're, things are going well, we're doing the right thing. And also I wanted to thank Elizabeth for the positive note. I think more often than not, the response that I get and many of my women clergy colleagues is that sort of positive response of, wow, now that I've experienced this woman preacher, woman pastor and priest, it changes their perspective on it. So, when you know someone who's really doing it, it makes a difference. That's all.
Thank you. We do have a question, it looks like, from Chris. Well, you want to go ahead and unmute?
I just wanted to say that I too had not really encountered a female pastor, any type of female clergy that wasn't in the children's ministry before I started at Emmanuel. And I just wanted to ask the panel or any of the other clergy that is in attendance, what was that first moment when you saw a female clergy and realized that there was a possibility for you to also be clergy?
I loved having Reverend Janelle Mahoney as someone that was a trailblazer for me. Honestly, though, I think I went into it kind of kicking and screaming in my own way. I was like, "Oh no, you've got to be kidding! This just can't be." And yet, I felt absolutely called to do this thing. And I don't know how. I know when I was a kid too, I was very engaged with the church until some certain things happened that kind of throw me off to another path for a while. But life comes full circle sometimes. And so if there are others.
I'll share. For me, there is, she's still alive, a woman, Bishop Ernestine Cleveland Reams, which is definitely well known in the Bay Area. And she was the first, I think, solo pastor forging her way. She owns blocks and blocks now of low-income apartments for the community. She does all this community work, but she was a preacher first. And in the, they weren't apostolic, but she's from the Church of God in Christ. So way back when, they were not looking so kindly on female pastors. And She talked about the times that they locked the doors on her and all kinds of things. And she's quite comical to hear. So she was my first, I think, exposure to female pastors. It didn't make me want to be a pastor. I still was determined to be, I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to be, you know, anything, not that dreaded P word, pastor of someone. I don't know. I felt like that was just, and it was a lot through a lot of prayer, kind of fasting, having to keep going back and asking God, are you sure that I accepted a call to pastor? But yeah, or it would be Bishop Ernestine Cleveland Reams was my first introduction to a female pastor.
The person that inspired me the most in my youth was not a pastor. She was the youth group leader, and a extremely powerful woman. And after I had left for seminary, she actually left the Missouri Synod Church and is now went to seminary and got ordained in the ELCA, and she's retired now. But it always inspires me, or I always thought, you know, even then I saw in her a pastor, and it is where she ended up.
We are, we've gone a few minutes past. We have one more question let's take one more question from Miriam here, and then we'll go back to KRISTIE to say goodnight. Go ahead, Miriam.
What is your, we're in uncharted waters due to the pandemic, and I'm a pastor's kid, so I completely believe this is the hardest job on the planet. Yes, it's a calling. But what is your biggest asset in continuing to steer your congregations forward?
I guess I'll just say, so many things parallel ancient times with plagues and everything. We are talking so much about Moses these days, been doing skits, and there's so many stories. I don't have to ever mention anything about current leaders because we all know pharaohs in our midst. And yet there's so much hope too. Always so much hope for better times to come and for the presence of the divine to walk with us through all sorts of things. And so I see this ancient collection of stories of our ancestors as having a lot to offer us as we walk through tricky times now too.
I will underscore Nancy's remarks. I've stepped off the beam, off the pulpit, but I've been watching my colleagues from afar dealing with this crisis. And I don't know who said it first, but in my mind, I think about Yavne. After the destruction of the Second Temple, the rabbis retreated from Jerusalem with the blessing of the Roman emperor and had to reinvent Judaism almost from scratch because now there was no longer a central shrine. And they built the rabbinic Judaism on which mainstream Judaism is founded today. And I have watched my colleagues of every stripe operate as though they were back in Yavne. They are reinventing their rabbinates. They are reinventing Judaism. They have gone from 0 to 60 in adopting and adapting to the technology. And I stand in awe and joy of their creativity in meeting this moment.
I so agree. I think initially there was just a brief moment of pause of what will we do? How will we be church, do church, etc. But not just for my congregation, for so many in our community and across the valley and just those that I'm in conversation with. I think we are enjoying the challenge of the day of how do you take everything that's going on right now and still be able to preach a gospel, still be able to share, bring forth light in a dark. I think it's the moment that the finest hour for the church to be able to stand, the temple, the congregation, to be able to really speak light into dark places. And we certainly have a lot of darkness around us now. And so I think that the church and the preachers and the people that I'm interacting with right now are just saying, no, this is, matter of factly, at our local church, there was one of the ministry leaders that says, you know what, let's put white lights all around the entire church, to even emphasize, whether we're there in person, whether we're not, that the church is not going anywhere. They're not dying, they're not dead. And of course, the people are the church. And so I think it's our finest hour, and we're finding new and innovative ways to still reach out and continue in the call and the vision that we all have had.
I'm going to say amen to what Pastor Trina said about the future and the opportunities. And just think what Zoom has been able to do for us tonight with this panel, to be able to bring all of these extraordinary women together. In doing research for this panel, I read I think Pew Research that has the most comprehensive analysis of American congregations. And according to them, for the mainline churches anyway, the percent of women pastors is still 11%. I think we can tell from the testimony of these women that the church is missing a great gift if we do not increase that percentage in the years to come. I want to thank the panelists tonight, our special guest, the audience for contributing and being engaged. And I think we have more conversation that we could build on here. I think we've really got something powerful. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure we can clap. I'm not sure we're all unmuted to clap, but certainly we do so. Okay.
Good night.
All right.
Good night.
Good night. And I think we can leave feeling very good.
Thank
And
you.
one miracle, my internet did not give out during this whole thing, and it has been in and out all day.
That's great. It is a miracle.
There we go.
I love it.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.